At a weekend meeting at Camp David, he decided to offer U.S. forces to Saudi Arabia to protect its oil fields. When he returned to Washington, he had made another decision.
I watched Dad get out of the helicopter, and there was this smoldering intensity to him. He knew that he needed to kick Saddam out of Kuwait, and I don't think he knew at that point exactly how he was going to do it. But there was this sort of focused, intense demeanor that was very different.
This will not stand. This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait. I've got to go. I have to go to work. I got to go.
He led with his gut, with his instincts. George Bush was a motive, emotional, intuitive, instinctive leader. Much more emotional than people thought.
I was surprised that he spoke out that quickly, but his mind had been made up that one way or another, the Iraqis had to leave Kuwait.
Now, that statement, this will not stand, doesn't translate into how we're going to make it not stand. Is it going to be sanctions? Is it going to be UN coalition action? Is it going to be unilateral U.S. action? And what exactly is it we're going to do?
Bush dispatched Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney to Saudi Arabia to convince the Saudis to accept American forces. Despite a pointed warning the U.S. forces would desecrate the Muslim Holy Land, the king accepted the U.S. offer. Osama bin Laden, the 33-year-old Islamic radical who issued the warning, was placed under confinement. The operation to protect Saudi Arabia was called Desert.
So in the last video, we left off right before this, talking about Iran and the revolution. Well, there's a country right next to Iran called Iraq. And Iraq became an independent country in the 1930s, had a monarchy, but by the 1950s was technically a republic, had a number of military dictatorships, and in 1968, a political party known as the Ba'athist Party, which was really an Arab socialist party that was very significant in Syria and Iraq, and actually had influence in Egypt for a time. This party took over Iraq in 1968. And they controlled Iraq for a long time after that. They were led by an organization called the Republican Guard, and this was the elite military group that really controlled Iraq. The man in charge of that organization from the late 60s on was a man named Saddam Hussein. You might have heard of him. Saddam Hussein had been a member of the Ba'athist Party since the early 60s. He helped him come to power in 1968. And in 1979, Saddam Hussein decided to make himself president of Iraq. He overthrew this man who was the president at the time, or convinced him that Saddam Hussein, this is Saddam Hussein here, would be a better president. So, the first thing he did was purge a number of political leaders. This is actually on a video you can find on YouTube where it shows Saddam Hussein has a bit of a show trial himself, similar to what we saw in other places, and just gets rid of a group of Ba'athist political leaders who he probably saw as opponents. One of Saddam Hussein's people he looked up to quite a bit was Joseph Stalin, in fact. So, Iraq in the 1980s. So Saddam Hussein attacks Iran in 1980. Now that's interesting, right? You have Iran's revolution that's happening. And there's actually the Iraq-Iran war that goes on through most of the 80s. During much of this war, he's actually covertly and somewhat overtly supported by the United States of America. Because the United States of America is at odds with, of course, Iran, with the overthrow of the Shah and with the new Iranian regime, which had the hostage crisis, and the new Iranian regime frankly hates the United States. And so the United States helps Iraq in this war to a great extent, feeds them information. But interestingly, it wasn't just the United States who helped Iraq during this war. Both the Soviet Union, yeah, it was a big deal still in the 1980s, helped Iraq, and France. Both sold weapons to, gave weapons to Iraq during this war. So the United States CIA gave information to Iraq to help in the war. And other Arab countries gave Iraq money, loaned them money to help fight this war. But Iran fought very well. They suffered in large numbers, probably 1 million casualties in this war. And more of those were on Iran's side. And it ended in a stalemate in 1988. And Saddam Hussein's government was in a lot of debt, and a lot of people had died. So he was not in a great situation. Now, remember, so you have Iraq, which produces a pretty good oil supply, Iran, you have the Saudi Arabia south of there, and Kuwait. Okay? So, in 1990, for a number of reasons, in August of 1990, Saddam Hussein decides to invade Kuwait. Now, Kuwait is a very small country on the southern tip of Iraq, which many in Iraq felt like shouldn't have been in a separate country anyway. Okay? And Kuwait had loaned money to Iraq during the war. Saddam Hussein was quite upset with his Kuwaiti and Saudi friends, former supporters, because he felt like they had kind of stopped supporting him, and he had fought this war for Arabs against the Iranians, and they had kind of, turned their back on it. So he decides to go into Kuwait and take it over, because another thing Kuwait was doing was drilling oil, or at least this is what he accused them of, is they were drilling oil across the border into his territory. Okay? So he decides to invade Kuwait, which Iraq did. Iraq had a much bigger army than Kuwait. They invade Kuwait and take it over in August of 1990. Now, the President of the United States, who was George Herbert Walker Bush, who had been vice president under Ronald Reagan, who we saw in the clip there, decided he was not going to let this stand. So he went to the Saudis. The big issue was, what about Saudi Arabia? Saddam had a very large army. The Iraqis had a very large army. And what if he decided to attack the Saudis? So the issue for the world was that Saddam could corner the market or come very close to controlling a huge portion of the world's oil. Okay? And he threatened the stability, I guess you'd say, of the Middle East. And if he invades Saudi Arabia after that and controls their oil, what happens? So, the United States went to the Saudis, as we heard in the video, and offered to put U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, which the Saudis accepted. Now, a lot of other Arab countries did join in this too. The Arab League, as it was known, joined with this. Egypt, for instance, was on the U.S. and Saudi side. But it is pretty interesting. It also made a lot of Arabs mad, including some people in Saudi Arabia, including a young man named Osama bin Laden, who we'll be talking a little bit more about later. So, what happened here was the United States eventually sent a very large force into Saudi Arabia. Other countries joined a coalition, including British, French, as I mentioned, some of those Arab countries. A number of countries joined, but primarily it was an American force. And Desert Storm started in February and into March. And essentially it was the United States and their allies driving the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And it was very successful. And very limited casualties on the U.S. or UN side too. And the Iraqis were forced out of Kuwait. Okay? In the 1990s, Saddam Hussein remained in power, The United States did not overthrow him at that time because the United States, I think, was rightly worried about Saddam Hussein's, and this is what was said by United States officials later, was rightly worried about Saddam Hussein's offsetting the power of the Iranians. Because if Saddam Hussein falls, maybe the Iranians gain more power. That was the question. In the 1990s, though, pressure remained on Saddam in Iraq. And you had the UN sanctions, which mean the amount of goods that could be sold into Iraq were cut off. And oil was limited in its sale out of Iraq. And the United States actually patrolled areas of Iraq in the skies to keep Saddam Hussein from bombing or attacking other groups in Iraq. Okay, they had no-fly zones. Okay, and the other thing was Saddam Hussein had to allow inspectors for so-called weapons of mass destruction. Now I say so-called. He did use, or the government of Iraq and the military of Iraq used chemical weapons during the war with Iran and in other circumstances. Okay, but so he agreed to stop that and turn those weapons over. And so there was inspectors that went into Iraq on a regular basis, or were supposed to in the 1990s. Okay. Now here's a picture of George H.W. Bush. So the father of George W. Bush, who later became president, George H.W. Bush, visiting American troops in Iraq in 1991. Now, going ahead, in 1998, here's President Clinton. President Clinton and prominent members of the U.S. Congress said it should be the United States policy to have so-called regime change in Iraq. Regime change. That is, that Saddam Hussein's rule should be over. Now, that policy at the time was to be implemented by sanctions and the continuing the no-fly zone in Iraq. But just want you to understand that was the official position of the U.S. government, and it wasn't just the president at the time, but the Congress promoted it, or many members of the Congress promoted it. In 2001, after the attacks of 9/11 particularly, but even before that, President Bush, the second President Bush, George W. Bush, the son of the first one, made regime change in Iraq the official policy of the United States. Okay? Remember that. And something real important happened after that, related to this dude, right? Osama bin Laden. Who was Osama bin Laden? Osama bin Laden was a man from Saudi Arabia. You can see the years he lived up there, 1957 to 2011. He fought in Afghanistan with a group known as the Mujahideen, Holy Warriors. The Mujahideen were Arabs and some other non-Arabs, but Muslims, many of them were Arabs, who went to Afghanistan to fight with the Afghanis, some Afghanis, against the Soviet Union. Remember I told you before the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. The United States, wanting to hurt the Soviet Union during the Cold War, supplied and supported many of these groups in the 1980s fighting the Soviet Union. They gave them weapons, money, and support. But the Mujahideen were devout Muslims, in their mind, fighting against an evil empire, the evil empire of the atheistic Soviets. Okay? And they won, in the sense that the Soviets left Afghanistan in 1988. In 1988, the group known as the Base, or Al-Qaeda, was formed. And Osama bin Laden became a prominent leader of a group, a part of that group, and a prominent spokesman for a certain position on Islamic thought and belief. Okay? I'll tell you what, I'm going to stop there, and I will pick up on that in a video upcoming.